back with part 3 with David Rose, talking about his book, The Big Eddie Club, talking about the case of Carlton Gary, case from Columbus, Georgia, and the Stocking Strangler murders that happened in 1977 and 1978. I got to tell you, David, this whole thing has blown me away, and it takes a lot to blow me away because I have personally been involved in a lot of crazy cases. I've seen a lot of crazy cases. I say sometimes I think I've seen it all, but obviously I haven't. This one really knocks my socks off. I don't even know if we're going to finish in this part 3, but for anybody out there, part 1, David kind of gave the history of Columbus, Georgia, talked about the murders, and we ended part 1 with Carlton Gary getting arrested. We ended part 2 with Carlton Gary having a criminal trial and getting convicted, despite some crazy developments and despite some powerful exculpatory evidence not being disclosed in a capital murder case. So now the criminal trial was in what, 1986?
Yep.
Okay. And I know you said this in part 1. What year do you get involved in looking into the case?
Well, I first heard about it in 1996, but I began to get involved in 1998.
So you didn't get involved until 1998, about 12 years after the conviction. Carlton Gary's still alive.
Yeah.
What happens in those 12 years, if anything, of substance? Is it just a lot of like legal appeals and whatnot?
Well, yes, but they were significant. So, I mean, the first stage was he had what's called his direct appeal to the state Supreme Court, which was really just a paper exercise. And the big issue that his attorney, Bud Seaman, who was still representing him, was hoping to bring out was that, it was wrong of the court to have refused him any funding. But he didn't succeed with that. The Georgia Supreme Court said that's fine. They tried to get it reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court, but they wouldn't look at it. So it was refused.
Okay.
So then you get into what's called habeas corpus. So the state habeas corpus, the first stage of the habeas corpus proceedings, whereby the defense has to allege there's been some kind of constitutional violation and uses that to explore the case further and to try to get the habeas court to order a new trial. Now, at this point, he had different attorneys. He was represented by a team from a capital appeals project in Atlanta, led by a man called Jeff Ertel, who did a really excellent job. Now, it was Jeff who got access to the district attorney's files in Columbus, Georgia.
He's the one who got that evidence about what Gertrude Miller had said and about and the shoe prints?
Yeah, exactly.
That doesn't move the needle? That doesn't help him get a new trial?
So there were several evidentiary hearings prior to the final arguments in that, and he didn't get anywhere. So the state court refused any relief in state habeas. When I got involved in 1998, he had now federal representation. It had moved to federal habeas, where you go through the same process. You have to allege there's been some kind of constitutional violation, and then you try and present exculpatory evidence. And he was in this being represented. His team was led by a man called Jack Martin, who's a very well-established Atlanta lawyer. He had, for example, successfully defended Richard Jewell, the man wrongly accused of the Atlanta Olympics bombing. And Jack has become over many years a very good friend of mine, and he's a fantastic, great guy who is truly committed to the cause of justice. So I worked very closely with Jack from then on, really. He engaged me as his official investigator, which meant I could go and visit Carlton much more easily on death row. And not only that, I could go in and out with documents and folders and all this kind of thing. And we wanted to try and attack other lines of new evidence. So at this point, we started looking at the trial transcript very, very closely and seeing how, because the trial defense had no resources, the prosecution had been able to present scientific evidence that was just absolute junk. Now, one of the most important things was serology. The victims of the Strangler, like most rape victims, in the developed world, had swabs taken from their bodies, their vaginas, when they had been attacked. Semen samples were taken from the remains of the victims, and indeed from Gertrude Miller, the woman who survived the attack, who testified against Carlton at his trial. And it became apparent, even while the state was still doing this in the early stages before the trial, that there was a problem, which was that the stocking strangler was what you call a non-secretor. Now, that's about 20% of the population. It's a genetic disposition, and you either are or are not a secretor. And if you're a secretor, that means that the blood group marker chemicals that you have in your blood that say whether you're type O or type A or whatever are not in your semen or your saliva. If you're a non-secretor, you don't have those. Well, that was a problem, because they had discovered that the stocking strangler was a non-secretor, but Carlton Gary was a very powerful secretor. He was producing, a great deal of this stuff. So they called this so-called expert, who testified that maybe he was a secretor after he'd been arrested when they did these tests, but maybe he was a non-secretor when he did the crimes. Well, this was just nonsense.
And that didn't go anywhere?
Well, what happened was I found an expert here in Oxford, England, a top expert from the University of Oxford, and he gave a fantastic affidavit saying that this was complete rubbish. You could not be moved from one to the other, and there was absolutely no way that on the basis of the results from the lab, which we found these results again. It was stuff that had been hidden. The detailed lab results. Yeah, it was more stuff in the file, and it was also marked in a file to be thrown away, and yet they hadn't done it. Yes.
To be thrown away.
Lab results. Yes, but the exact.
Again, if we're writing our screenplay and you say, let's put it in a file called "To Be Thrown Away," I'd be like, we can't call it that.
It's nuts.
Let me ask you this. It may be an obvious question, but I want to make sure I understand this.
Yeah.
In the what I'll call in the post-conviction proceedings.
Yes.
Does it get presented in open court that there's the size 9 prints, there's the Gertrude Miller, it was too dark, I don't know if it was black or white, and there was the secretor, non-secretor issue. Does that all get presented to the court?
Okay, so in federal habeas, not the shoe print, because that I discovered at a very late stage. And I think so. In state habeas, the Gertrude Miller hidden statements were produced. Doubts about the confession were produced.
Didn't get anything done. There was no relief for that.
No. But so when the federal habeas thing started, the first thing to tell you is that the judge who heard the federal habeas stage of the case was a man called Clay Land.
I've heard that name before, Land.
Land, exactly. So he was the nephew of the judge who had refused funding to Carlton, who had himself covered up the murder of a civil rights leader and was the son of a 2-time lynch mob leader.
It's, again, if we're scripting this, you're saying, let's just make this guy the nephew.
Yeah, well, he was. He is. He's still the federal court judge in Columbus, Georgia.
Oh, my God.
In the Southern District of Georgia. Anyway, but there was something else. So we presented the report by my expert on the serology typings, saying these lab results show it's just rubbish. And yet still the state tried to contest this. And they said, no, it's perfectly possible that, there isn't a fundamental problem here, and that maybe, he was a non-secretor, now he's a secretor. And anyway, what they said was this. They said that when Carlton was arrested, they tested his saliva. And so his saliva suggested he was a secretor. But they said maybe his semen shows that he is, in fact, a non-secretor in his semen. Again, our expert said that's nonsense. So we had an evidentiary hearing on this. But prior to that evidentiary hearing in the federal court, I decided to take matters into my own hands. We knew what the state was going to say. We knew that they were going to go on this. It was saliva, not semen, that gave you that result. So I went into the prison, and by now I'm the investigator, so I'm able to do this. And I go in with a file of documents and also 2 envelopes. And I say, and I go out for lunch.
I think you're up to something here. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So it was so surreal. So I went in there with before in the morning with the first envelope, and it has some blotting paper on it, absorbent paper inside the envelope. I said, okay, Carlton, I'm going to go out for lunch. I'm coming back in the afternoon. I want you to produce a semen sample in your cell and put it in this envelope and give it to me when I come back. So I have some of your semen.
Uh-huh.
So that's what he did. And when he came back, I produced the second envelope. I said, okay, I now want you to pluck hairs from your head, including the roots, so I can do a DNA cross match between your semen and the hair, which I have witnessed you plucking, so that we know that's your semen. And then we'll see if your semen shows you're a secretor or a non-secretor. Well, following instructions by a leading member of the Royal College of Physicians in the UK, I then took the semen back to my hotel room. I laid it out flat on the radiator to dry. and then we sent the samples to be tested. They were tested pro bono by a lab. And they came back with this result that there was no way on earth that this semen could possibly have come from the stocking strangler, because he was a non-secretor and Carlton Gary was a very...
Did this get presented to the court?
This was presented to the federal court at an evidentiary hearing, I think in 2003, and Judge Clayland, the federal judge, ruled against it, did not give any relief on that basis. Now, you may think of, you may have a question in your head here.
Why?
And the question you might have is this: okay, so you're going on this serology type stuff, but what about DNA testing? Well, back in the 90s, when Carlton was still in state habeas, DNA testing had just begun to be used widely and had been used by the Innocence Project and others in exoneration cases. And, there had been exonerations of people on death row on the basis that they had the wrong DNA. So at that stage in state habeas, Jeff Ertl, then representing Carlton, tried to get the rape kit swabs taken from the victims, the slides made from them, whatever, so they can do a DNA match with Carlton. And at that point, they had an evidentiary hearing in front of a state judge, and the district attorney of Columbus, Georgia, testified that it was impossible to give up these samples for DNA testing because they had all been destroyed on the basis that they were a, quote, biohazard, unquote.
A
biohazard? A biohazard.
What?
So it seemed that the DNA testing was a closed book. So we now come to the most extraordinary evidence of all.
And the judge was like, okay, I the biohazard.
Yeah, they said it was policy. Okay, so at this point, time is running out. We're getting near the end of the first decade of the 21st century, and he's going to get an execution date soon, and it's time is running out. He goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they say cert denied. And then one day, I'm sitting in the room where I'm talking to you now in Oxford, England, at my computer, and I'm thinking, what are we going to do? And I just think to myself, I wonder if the local Columbus paper has written anything recently, published anything about Carlton Gary. So I go online and I type in, Carlton Gary into the search box.
And let me pause you there before you tell the story. I have another podcast called Connect, where it's kind of my spiritual journey. And I talk about the universe. That is the universe giving you a download. Yeah. You got a download from the universe directly telling you need to check. You need to go on the computer and poke around. You got that out of the blue for no reason, right?
Yeah.
And tell me then what you did.
So I go online. I do a search for Carlton Gary, and I find an article that had been published not long before, which was an interview with the police officer who was about to retire, who had for some years been the custodian of the evidence storeroom in the Columbus Police Department, and where different exhibits from trials were stored. And in the course of this interview, this police officer points to a shelf, and he points to a box on the shelf, and he says, so in that box, that's where all the semen rape kit samples and slides made from them from the Columbus stocking stranglings have been stored all these years.
What? Can I? I'm gonna have my podcast producer insert here the sound of a bomb exploding.
Yes.
What?
Yes. So these samples hadn't been destroyed as a biohazard at all.
The guy lied about that?
They were there the whole time. And they lied. The district attorney. Now, this stage, it wasn't the guy who prosecuted Carlton. It was his then assistant. It was a man called Doug Pullen, who later became a Superior Court judge. But he had testified on oath in 1994, I think it was, that all these samples had been destroyed as a biohazard, and they hadn't been. The whole story was a pack of lies. Anyway, pretty soon we were able to get the Innocence Project to send an expert, and Jack, my friend Carlton's attorney, went to Columbus and they got custody of the samples, or at least they applied to the court. But meanwhile, the clock's ticking.
Carlton's still alive when you find this out.
Yeah, he's still alive. It's December 2009. As I say, the clock's ticking, and he had an execution date. I think it was for the 16th of December 2009. So the attorneys, Jack and his colleague Mike McIntyre, apply for a stay. They say, we've got to do this DNA testing, and the state say, no, you don't need to do this testing. It's irrelevant. It won't find anything.
The state of Texas.
Yeah. So the state court, the trial court, the superior court that had the power to do this, wouldn't give a stay.
No stay granted.
No stay granted.
We do conclusive DNA testing that could prove this man's innocence, who's going to die on December 16th.
Exactly. At 7 p.m. on December 16th, local time. At this point, I'm in Israel on a journalistic assignment. And I think I'm going to wake up tomorrow and Carlton's going to be dead. And I was in a taxi coming back from a bar in Tel Aviv where I'd basically gone out and got drunk because I just thought, this is the worst injustice. I don't know how I can deal with this. And my cell phone rang, and it was Mike McIntyre, Jack's colleague, and he said, David, we got to stay. They got a stay from the Georgia Supreme Court 3.5 hours before he would have been executed.
Oh my God. So this is the first piece of good news we've had on the whole podcast
It's the first piece of good news. Anyway, what then ensues is a lengthy process. And so at this point, because he's had cert refused by the Supreme Court of the United States, he's gone through all the normal appeals, there's only one way he can try and get his case reopened, and that is through what is called an extraordinary motion for a new trial.
The other is the district attorney's office could just agree to vacate the conviction.
Sure.
They don't have to oppose it. They don't have to deny it. They could just say, you're right. The evidence is overwhelming. We agree. Only have to go to the court if the state's attorney's office won't do their job and do the right thing. That's what's happening to me in the Chester Weger case. I'm only fighting it because the state's attorney's office still is fighting it. Yeah. So you get this, you got to do this extraordinary motion for new trial, blah, 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 double secret probation motion for new trial.
I mean, that's what happened. And it took for a very long time. I mean, so 2009 was the execution date. There was a set of evidentiary hearings over about 2 weeks, which I went over for.
Do they do the DNA testing? Did they get the result?
I'm going to come to that.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You got me on the edge of my seat here. I'm sorry. We Americans are very impatient. We're not as good as storytellers as you guys are over there in the UK. We are. I mean, I'm so gripped. Go ahead. Take your time.
Okay. So at the evidentiary hearing, it emerges that all this stuff is aired. So the shoe size not fitting, the fingerprints being taken in very questionable circumstances. There was also the bite cast. We haven't talked about the bite cast. The killer had left a deep bite impression on one of the victim's breasts. He'd basically tried to bite.
What, Carlton Gary had no teeth or something?
No, he had beautifully. So there was a bite cast made of this bite, and it showed that the killer had incredibly twisted up, horrible teeth in a terrible condition. Carlton had these perfect teeth, and he'd actually been. I mean, this is another aspect of the case. At the time of these killings, when he was supposedly infiltrating himself into this all-white neighborhood to commit these terrible crimes, he was appearing every night in TV commercials for a Columbus, Georgia clothing store.
Oh my goodness.
That's mainly served the black community, called the Movin' Man. He was a very good looking man, and he was modeling these clothes on TV. He was instantly recognizable, and he had this lovely set of teeth. So all that was heard. But, and the serology evidence was heard again. But the big one, the big thing was DNA. So finally we had a DNA result. And what the DNA result showed beyond any question, you've heard about Gertrude Miller, the key moment in the trial when she testifies. She's the one woman who survives the Stranglers attack. She testifies that Carlton had raped her. She recognized him. This has supposedly been burned into her memory, etc. The semen recovered from her vagina and put on a slide by the police after she was attacked was not left there by Carlton Gary. There was a conclusive rejection. It was in fact the Bodie lab that found this. There was no way that Carlton Gary was
I'm going to insert
not the
another
stocking strangler.
sound of a bomb going off here. As soon as you got the call, the lawyers got the call and said, hey, the DNA came back from the Gertrude Miller case. It is conclusively 100% not Carlton Gary. The next call would be to the district attorney's office saying, hey, the DNA doesn't match. And 5 minutes later, the conviction should have been vacated.
Yeah.
It should have been overdone at that point. This guy's released. We made a colossal mistake. We have forensic evidence. There's no doubt. We're sorry. How does that not happen?
Well, I'll tell you. So the state argued that although up until that point, it had always insisted that Gertrude Miller was raped by the stocking strangler.
Oh, yeah.
But they hadn't got fingerprints from that crime scene.
Oh,
Well, maybe
yeah.
it was someone else.
Yeah. Maybe he didn't do that one, but we
Maybe didn't do that one.
What
Now,
absolute shit.
So that was their position.
Shame on them.
But it gets worse. It gets worse.
It gets worse?
Oh, yes. So one of the crime scenes where they did charge him with the murder because they said they'd found his fingerprints was a victim called Martha Thurmond. And this was the sort of perfect ideal source of a semen sample, because the killer had left a kind of a glob of neat semen on her abdomen after raping and murdering her. And this was swabbed. And this, here's a crime where he is convicted and DNA testing should eliminate him. So this is what emerged at this evidentiary hearing. Sabotage is the only way to describe it. It emerged that at the point, so the Miller sample was tested by the Bodie lab, so that's independent. But for some reason, I can't remember exactly why now, it was this state lab run by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation that was going to test this sample from taken from the body of Martha Thurmond. And when we got to this hearing, it emerged that somebody, a person unknown working in the GBI crime lab, had, shortly before the test on the glass slides made from the swabs from Martha Thurmond's body, he had smeared these. He had produced his own sample of semen. He had, I guess, gone to the toilet and to be crude, jerked off and produced semen, and he then smeared his own semen across both the slides and the equipment, so contaminating it, making it impossible to do a test on those slides.
My head is going to explode.
Yes.
What?
Yes. So, and worse, then they then claim, so there was yet another case where
hold on a minute.
Yeah.
The crime lab guy who's going to do the testing masturbates and puts his semen on the semen recovered from that victim, thereby contaminating the sample?
I don't think it was the person who was going to do the testing, because that was actually going to be a woman called Connie Pickens.
The guy who worked there did this?
Yeah, she had passed away by the time of this evidentiary hearing. But yeah, somebody who worked with her had done that.
Let me pause again, because I keep going back to, you and I are screenwriters, and we're writing this incredible story of this capital case injustice. And now you pitch to me the idea of, hey, Andy, let's make it so that we can't test the semen found on the abdomen of this victim because somebody in the lab produces their own semen and smears it on the slide. I would say to you, how much psychedelic drugs have you done?
I know.
You can't put this in our screenplay. No one's going to believe it. It's absolutely insane. And this is what fucking happened?
This happened.
Oh my God.
And it was said in open court. It was said in a court with TV cameras rolling in Columbus, Georgia.
Oh my God.
I mean, I've never had anything.
So they couldn't test that semen.
You couldn't test it. It was destroyed. And even more strange is this. So there was another victim called Jean Diemenstein. Now, he wasn't charged with killing her because they didn't find his fingerprints, supposedly, at her house. But suddenly, the state said, oh, we have found a DNA match between a vaginal washing from this victim, Jean Diemenstein, and Carlton Gary. So the defense said, well, where's the evidence? We want to test this. We don't believe you. Oh, it's disappeared. The envelopes containing this are empty.
Oh,
Do we believe them, given what we now know? I don't
mean,
believe them. I mean, anyway, with these extraordinary motions for a new trial, the way it works is that a judge in the court that tried the case, in this case, the Superior Court of Columbus, Georgia, the judge was a man called Judge Jordan, who had previously been a real estate lawyer. He had no experience in criminal law. He had to determine whether to grant a new trial on the basis of the new evidence. And he had to apply 3 tests. This is governed by a precedent in Georgia law, a case of a man called Timberlake. He had to determine whether the evidence was fresh and unavailable at the time of the trial. Well, clearly it was. So it passed that test. Then he had to determine whether it was credible. Was it credible evidence that was well-founded? And again, it was yes. And then he had to make the final determination. Had the jury known about this new evidence, would they have reached a different verdict or reached a different sentence, sentenced him to life, not death? And in each case, I mean, I think there were like 9 separate headings, of course, starting with the DNA match that didn't happen, or the fake, the DNA exclusion with Gertrude Miller. Judge Jordan rejected each and every one without giving any reasons, without any explanation. He didn't have to do that. He just said, in my view, the jury would not have reached a different outcome. And so that was it.
That was the end of the legal road?
It was the end of the legal road. And a few months later, Carlton Gary was executed.
Oh my God. Yeah.
But there is just one final wrenching twist to this story. On the very last day that he had on Earth, he wasn't able to, he was married. He was married to a woman who had stood by him for a very long time, although she did meet him after he'd already been incarcerated. He wasn't allowed to see her on his final day, the day of his execution, but he was able to phone her. And Deborah, his wife, had taken the precaution of arranging with a local TV station that they would record his phone call to her. And he, of course, knew that was going to happen. And so what happened was that he made a kind of impassioned final statement of innocence. And he talked about Gertrude Miller, the woman who had falsely identified him. And he said, look, I don't blame her. She was under a lot of pressure, but it just wasn't me. And we know it wasn't me because there's a DNA test that shows it wasn't me. And that's why it is not going to be justice if you put me to death tonight, as I expect they will. Anyhow, they did put him to death. And that was in 2018. And it was a terrible, terrible thing.
I don't say this lightly. You have shaken me to my core. I really don't say this lightly. What I'm feeling right now, to think there could be a case where the stakes can't be any higher. It's a capital case. It's a death penalty case. Somebody's life's at stake. And there could be so much misconduct, so many red flags, so much exculpatory evidence. And despite it all, the prosecutors march forward wanting to kill this man and succeed. It reminds me, we had a case in Peoria, Illinois. We got a guy out of prison after 47 years. His name was Cleve Heidelberg. And my partner, Amy Hijawi, who's a fantastic writer and great legal mind, she wrote a brief, and I think the first sentence of her brief said, this is a legal lynching. A legal lynching happened in this case. And that's what happened to Carlton Gary. It was a legal lynching. It just breaks my heart. I really am just in shock and awe of all the things that happened. And what really surprises me is I wasn't aware of it. And I'm sure back in the day, it got a lot of press, but the point is, I was a living, breathing person, in 2018 and all these years. I don't remember, it didn't hit me. And I think you shared so much information that John Q. Public wouldn't know. We're gonna have more to say on this down the road, kind of where we go from here, because what I want to talk about maybe in the next episode, and we're gonna wrap this one in a minute. I want to. I don't think the case should end here. I think the story needs to be told more in a much bigger, powerful way. I think it needs to be there's it needs to be told so people can be educated about how these things can happen, and just so it can't happen again. It's just such an incredible injustice. I want to continue the conversation with you. Are you working? I mean, I know the book came out in what year?
Well, the original edition came out in 2007, and then what you're holding there is a revised edition that came out in 2011. So, I mean, the book doesn't tell the whole story. I haven't brought the story up to date in book form. I mean,
Well,
if a publisher was interested in a new edition taking the story up to date, I mean, certainly that would be something that might interest me to write it.
I'd love to help
Mm.
you tell this story in some way, and I'd love to talk to you about it. We could do this, at some point. Documentary movie, an unscripted version. You could have a scripted version. Uh, let's keep the conversation going.
Mm.
And I'm looking at these photos now in the book, and I mean, it's just incredible. Just seeing these photos now. Um, Goodness gracious.
Yeah, I mean, when they put Carlton to death, after they just put him to death, the the police chief of Columbus, Georgia, who was a man called Ricky Boren, uh, and he had been one of the detectives who was on the case back in the 80s,
Mhm.
and he came out of the prison where the execution had taken place, and he faced the reporters' cameras, and he said, "What took place here tonight was lethal justice."
Oh my God.
It was, I mean, it wasn't lethal justice, it was lethal injustice. And it, you know, I'm honored and privileged to be able to try to keep the memory of Carlton and what happened to him alive. And so thank you for having
There's
me
a
on,
picture of
because
him with his lawyer.
yeah,
Uh, the guy in the white shirt's the lawyer.
that's Bud. Yeah, that's Bud
And
Seaman. Yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's Carlton
yeah,
Gary.
yeah.
You know what? I also think, and this goes with my kind of Connect podcast, and if you, I urge you to listen to some of the things I think. The universe brought you and I together too. Uh, David Middleman suggested we meet, and it was more in the context of genetic genealogy. Um, we met for a reason, and it was so you could share this story in a powerful way. And I think you and I are going to do some work on this case to tell the story more powerfully to the world, to a much bigger audience, because it's a story that needs to be told. So we're gonna have a part 4 down the road once the dust settles. But I
Okay.
want to ask you real quick: did the DNA um, from Gertrude Miller ever get put into CODIS or like a DNA database?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it did, but I don't think they found a match.
Okay, so this is where what we should talk about then is the
Mm,
potential. This is where Othram comes in, is genetic
mm.
genealogy.
Yeah.
I don't know how it works with standing and who has the right to try to get it tested. Maybe it's his family, somebody like that. But I'd be curious to see if there might be an avenue if somebody was willing to do genetic
Mm,
genealogy on that DNA from Gertrude Miller,
yeah.
find out who it is, and go from there.
Well, the scientist who did that test is a man called Greg Hampikian, who is quite well known. He was involved in the wrongful conviction of Amanda Knox in Perugia, Italy, and he did the DNA testing in that case that showed that the DNA of the real killer was all over the room where the murder happened, and there was no DNA from Amanda Knox. And I mean, so my first thing might be I'll contact him, and I don't know how or in what form they record the results, but maybe that's something we can take forward.
Well, I mean, the reason I say it is I feel like the family of Carlton Gary is probably still interested in justice, and
Definitely.
and they want the world to know that Carlton Gary had nothing to do with these crimes. And this happened in my case in the Chester Uyghur and the Star Rock murders. We were able to take a hair that was recovered off the finger of one of the victims in 1960. This is amazing. Get a DNA result on it 60 plus years later. It was a male profile, not Chester Uyghur. Just like your case, State's Attorney's Office in Will County, Illinois said, well, who cares? Doesn't matter. So what? Could be anybody, maybe somebody from the morgue, somebody who processed the crime scene. So thank God I found David Middleman in Othram, and we did genetic genealogy on that hair. It's a different kind of sequence, and it came back to one of 3 local brothers who lived near the park. Okay. Now we know. Now we know that it came back to one of those persons. So the technology is unbelievable. It's being used more and more. Othram is solving crimes every week. They're identifying bodies, Jane Does, John Does. It's tremendous. So I think there's an opportunity there. And I don't know, you may have physical evidence in the other 7 cases. There might be, David even told me you can potentially get a genetic sequence from touch DNA. So you could have the clothing that was used to strangle her, the stockings, who knows? All I'm saying is genetic genealogy may be waiting to do its part now and help identify who actually committed the crime. So that's to be continued. I wanted to throw that out there.
Well, I'm going to find out what happened to certainly the Miller sample. And yeah. I mean, my hunch is that in the other cases, because, obviously the case is closed, the wrongfully convicted alleged perpetrator has been executed. So I doubt there's any kind of preservation of materials by the state, but I'm going to try and see what we can do.
Surprised. Could be sitting on a shelf in a dust shelf somewhere. David Rose, I am so impressed with the work you've done. I'm so glad we've met. I feel like I've known you for years. You've got this passion to tell these stories of injustice that I do. I got a feeling you and I are going to be talking a lot more down the road, and I look forward to it. And thank you for coming on. Not 1, not 2, but 3 episodes of True Crime with Andy Hale, and we could have had 3 more to be continued. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. All the best.